The wind that tore across the North Dakota plains didn't just carry snow. It carried a bitterness that felt like it could strip the skin right off the bone. Sarah stood on the porch, her boots buried in a drift that had formed in less than an hour, the wood of the door inches from her nose. She didn't knock. She knew better than to knock. The sound of the heavy iron bolt sliding home from the inside had been final, a metallic crack that severed her life into two distinct parts, before the cold and after. Beside her, Toby shivered so violently that his teeth clicked together, a rhythmic, terrifying sound against the howling gale. He was only 7, small for his age, with eyes that were currently wide with a panic he couldn't vocalize. Sarah gripped his shoulder, her fingers digging into the wool of his coat, trying to transfer whatever heat she had left into his trembling frame. She looked down at the bundle at her feet, a single burlap sack hastily stuffed with a woolen blanket, a small cast-iron skillet, a box of lucifer matches, and a hunting knife she had swiped from the table in the chaos. That was it. That was the sum total of their inheritance from a man who had promised to love and cherish, but had instead chosen whiskey and a hardened heart. She grabbed the sack with her free hand, the rough fabric scratching her frozen skin. There was no use screaming at the door. Jeb was likely already back in his chair, the bottle raised, drowning out the reality of what he had just done. To stay on the porch was to die. The temperature was dropping with the sun, and the horizon was already bruising into a deep, unforgiving purple. Sarah turned her back on the house, on the warm hearth and the smell of tobacco and stale beer, and faced the open frontier. The snow was knee-deep in places, crusty on top and powdery underneath, making every step a labor. She pulled Toby close to her hip, shielding his face with her own body, blocking the wind that sought to steal the breath from his lungs. They had to move. Movement was life. Stagnation was death. She didn't know where they were going, only that the tree line to the west offered a jagged silhouette against the sky, a promise of something other than this exposed, flat emptiness. "Walk, Toby," she said, her voice sounding thin and snatched away by the wind. "Just keep your feet moving. Do not stop." The journey to the foothills took an eternity, measured not in miles but in the gradual numbness creeping up Sarah's extremities. Her toes had long since ceased to report pain, replaced by a dull, wooden sensation that made stumbling inevitable. The wind was relentless, a physical weight pushing against their chests, demanding they lie down and sleep. It was a seductive offer, the drowsiness of hypothermia whispering that it would be warm and easy to just close their eyes. Sarah fought it with a ferocious, silent anger. She focused on the image of Jeb's face, sneering as he pointed to the door, and let that hatred burn like a coal in her gut. It was the only fuel she had. Toby was dragging now, his small legs unable to lift high enough to clear the drifts. Sarah hoisted him up, his weight heavy despite his size, his head lolling against her shoulder. He was dangerously quiet. She gritted her teeth, feeling the strain in her lower back, and forced one foot in front of the other. The ground began to rise, the snow thinning where the rock jutted through the earth like broken bones. They were reaching the rough country, a place no cattleman wanted, which meant it was the only place they might find something the world had forgotten. The topography changed rapidly as they climbed, the rolling plains giving way to sharp inclines and scattered boulders the size of wagons. The wind screamed louder here, funneling through the narrow passes of the stone, but the rock also offered potential. Sarah scanned the gray, twilight-stained faces of the cliffs, looking for a shadow that was darker than the rest. She didn't need a house. She needed a womb in the earth, something to swallow them up and hide them from the freezing night. Her breath came in ragged gasps, misting and freezing instantly on her scarf. Then she saw it, a fissure near the base of a limestone overhang. It wasn't a grand entrance, just a vertical crack that widened at the bottom, shielded by a fallen slab of granite that acted as a natural windbreak. It looked like a scar in the mountainside. She scrambled toward it, her boots slipping on the icy shale, clutching Toby so tight she feared she might bruise him. Reaching the opening, she dropped to her knees, dragging the sack and the boy through the gap. The silence was the first thing that hit her. The wind still roared, but it was outside, a beast pacing the perimeter, unable to get in. The air inside was still, smelling of damp earth and ancient dust, but it was dry. Sarah collapsed onto the stone floor, her lungs burning, pulling Toby into her lap. It was pitch black beyond the few feet of gray light filtering in from the entrance. She ran her hands over Toby's face. His skin was like marble, cold and smooth. Panic, sharp and electric, spiked in her chest. She stripped off her own outer coat and wrapped it around him, doubling the insulation, then pulled the woolen blanket from the sack and draped it over both of them, creating a cocoon. They were huddled in the throat of the cave, terrified and exhausted, but they were out of the wind. This crack in the rock was a poor substitute for a home, but as Sarah held her son and listened to his shallow, rhythmic breathing, she knew it was the only castle they were going to get. The darkness inside the cave was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press against Sarah's eyes. She didn't dare light a match yet. She had no fuel for a fire, and the brief flare of light would only emphasize how alone they were once it died. Instead, she relied on touch and sound. She sat with her back against the rough, cold stone wall, Toby curled into a tight ball against her chest. She could feel the slow thaw beginning in her own limbs, the painful prickling of blood returning to frozen capillaries. It hurt, a stinging ache that throbbed in her fingers and toes, but she welcomed it. Pain meant life. Numbness was the enemy. She spent the hours of the night in a state of semi-consciousness, never fully sleeping, always listening. Every shift of the wind outside sounded like footsteps. Every settling of the rock sounded like a threat. Her mind raced through an inventory of their reality. No food, no water, no wood, just the clothes on their backs and the few items she had grabbed in a blind panic. Toby stirred, a small whimper escaping his throat. "Mama?" His voice was a croak, dry and frightened. "Is he coming?" The question broke Sarah's heart more effectively than the cold ever could. She tightened her grip on him, rocking gently back and forth in the darkness. "No, baby," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He ain't coming. He can't find us here. Nobody can find us." It was a lie and a truth wrapped together. They were invisible to the world, which meant they were safe from Jeb, but it also meant no savior was coming down the trail with a wagon full of supplies. They were entirely on their own. She rubbed Toby's back, feeling the small ridges of his spine. He was too thin even before this. Survival wasn't just about staying warm, it was about calories. The human body was a furnace that needed fuel, and theirs were running on fumes. She made a silent vow to the darkness that she would turn this stone tomb into a fortress. She would tear life out of this frozen wasteland with her bare hands if she had to. Morning arrived not with a burst of sunlight, but with a gradual graying of the air, revealing the interior of their refuge. It was deeper than she had thought, narrowing as it went back into the hill, the floor covered in a mixture of dirt and loose gravel. It was dry, thank God. Sarah disentangled herself from the blanket, tucking it tightly around Toby, who was still asleep, his face pale but peaceful. She stood up, her joints popping, her muscles stiff and protesting every movement. She moved to the entrance and peered out. The storm had broken. The sky was a pale, hard blue, and the sun was rising over a landscape that looked like a sheet of white paper, blinding and pristine. The beauty of it was cruel. The snow hid the dangers and buried the resources. She stepped out, shielding her eyes, and listened. Underneath the silence of the morning, she heard something faint. A low, gurgling murmur. Water. She followed the sound, stepping carefully down the slope, her eyes scanning for dry wood. The wind had scoured the rock face clean, but down in the crevices, dead brush and driftwood had accumulated. She noted it, but didn't stop. She needed water first. 100 yards down the ravine she found it, a creek, partially frozen over but flowing fast and clear through a break in the ice. It was black against the snow, steaming slightly in the frigid air. Sarah knelt by the edge, breaking a thin layer of rim ice with the heel of her boot. She cupped her hands and drank. The water was shockingly cold, making her teeth ache, but it tasted like sweet salvation. As the ripples settled, she saw movement in the shadow of the bank. A flash of silver. A trout, sluggish in the winter current, holding position against the flow. Her stomach gave a violent growl, a reminder of the emptiness that was beginning to claw at her insides. They had no fishing line, no hook, but the water was shallow here and the fish were slow. Sarah returned to the cave with a singular purpose. Toby was awake, sitting up and rubbing his eyes, looking small and lost in the pile of wool. "I need you to be brave, Toby," she said, her tone businesslike to mask her worry. "I need you to gather everything that looks like dry grass or twigs from right outside the door. Can you do that?" Toby nodded, his eyes trusting. Sarah took the hunting knife from the sack. It was a good knife, heavy and sharp, one of the few things of quality Jeb had owned. She went back out, not to the water yet, but to a thicket of scrub oak she had passed. She selected a straight, sturdy branch, green enough to have some flex but hard enough to drive. She hacked it off, then sat on a dry rock in the sun, whittling the end. She didn't just sharpen it to a point. She carved barbs into the wood, small notches facing backward to hold whatever she struck. It took an hour, her hands cramping in the cold, but she didn't stop until the spear looked lethal. When she returned to the creek, the sun was higher, casting a glare on the water that made it hard to see. She had to remove her boots and stockings to wade in. The water was agony. It felt like stepping into a bear trap, the cold seizing her calves and making her gasp. She stood perfectly still, the spear raised, her breath held in her chest. She had to become like the heron she used to watch on the marshlands back home, statuesque, patient, deadly. The trout were wary now, sensing the disturbance. She waited, her legs going numb, the pain turning into a dull, throbbing absence of sensation. Minutes stretched. A shadow drifted near her left foot. It was a good size, perhaps 2 pounds. Sarah didn't look directly at it. She looked through the water, calculating the refraction. She waited for it to pause, to drift just an inch closer. Then, with a grunt of exertion, she drove the spear down. The water exploded in a spray of ice and foam. She felt the resistance, the frantic vibration of life on the end of the wood, and she heaved it upward, flipping the writhing silver shape onto the snowy bank. She scrambled out of the water, ignoring her frozen feet, and clubbed the fish with a stone to end its suffering. It lay there, vibrant and real against the white snow. It was food. It was life. Back at the cave, the mood had shifted. The terror of the night had receded, replaced by the immediate busy work of survival. Toby had done well. A small pile of dry moss and brittle twigs sat near the entrance. Sarah quickly dried her feet and put her boots back on, the friction slowly bringing feeling back. Now came the second test. Fire. She cleared a small circle in the dirt floor near the entrance, arranging stones to contain the heat. She built a small pyramid of the finest moss and twigs. She took the box of matches, her hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the pressure. Matches were finite. Every failure was a step toward death. She struck the first one against the rough strip on the box. It flared with a hiss, a beautiful tongue of yellow flame. She cupped it instantly, protecting it from the drafts, and touched it to the dry moss. Smoke curled, gray and acrid, and then a small orange glow took hold. She fed it gently, breath by breath, adding slightly larger twigs until the fire cracked and popped, establishing its own rhythm. The smell of the fire changed the cave instantly. It stopped feeling like a hole in the ground and started feeling like a dwelling. Sarah cleaned the trout with the knife, her movements efficient and practiced, wasting nothing. She skewered the fillets on green sticks and set them over the coals. The scent of roasting fish, fat rendering and skin crisping, filled the small space, and it was the most intoxicating perfume she had ever smelled. Toby shuffled closer to the fire, his eyes fixed on the cooking meat, his mouth slightly open. "Is it ready?" he asked, his voice stronger now. "Almost," Sarah said, watching the flesh turn from translucent to opaque. She reached out and brushed a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "We have a house, Toby, and we have supper." When they ate, they did so in silence, savoring every bite. The fish was flaky and sweet, warming them from the inside out. Sarah watched her son eat, watching the color return to his face, the tension leaving his small shoulders. She felt a fierce, burning pride well up in her chest, hotter than the fire. Jeb had thrown them out to die. He had expected them to freeze or come crawling back to beg. But here they were. They had water. They had fire. They had food. As the sun began to dip low again, casting long shadows across the floor of their cave, Sarah added a larger piece of wood to the fire. She looked around at the rough stone walls, illuminated by the dancing light. It was harsh, it was bare, and it was cold, but it was theirs. She pulled the blanket around them again, but this time the shivering had stopped. "We're going to be okay," she told Toby, and this time she believed it. She looked at the remaining matches, then at the knife, then at the entrance where the night was waiting. The days that followed ran together in a blur of gray light and aching muscle, a routine carved out of necessity rather than comfort. Sarah learned quickly that survival was not a singular event, but a relentless cycle of chores that could not be skipped. The creek remained their lifeline, providing the trout that kept their bellies from hollowing out completely. But the fish were lean, lacking the heavy fat needed to fight off the deep chill of the nights. Sarah spent hours by the water, her feet wrapped in strips of the burlap sack to afford an extra layer of insulation against the frozen mud, waiting for the flash of silver. She became efficient, almost mechanical, striking with the spear and cleaning the catch before the blood could freeze on her hands. But food was only half the battle. The cave, for all its stony solidity, was drafty. The wind had a way of curling around the limestone slab at the entrance, searching for them like a cold, invisible hand. Sarah decided they needed a wall. It was a daunting task for a woman and a small boy, but the alternative was freezing in their sleep. They spent 2 days scouring the immediate area for loose rocks, dragging them back to the cave mouth. Toby, despite his size, worked with a grim determination that mirrored his mother's. He carried the smaller stones, his face red from the exertion, piling them in a heap while Sarah hefted the heavier boulders. They mixed mud from the creek bank with dead pine needles to create a thick mortar, packing it into the gaps between the stones. It was grueling, filthy work. The mud sucked the heat from their fingers, turning them stiff and clumsy. But slowly, a waist-high barrier began to rise across the gap. It wasn't pretty, a jagged, ugly scar of rock and earth, but when night fell and the wind picked up, the difference was immediate. The fire's heat, previously snatched away by the draft, now pooled in the back of the cave, creating a pocket of warmth that felt almost luxurious. As they sat behind their fortification, eating the charred fish, Sarah looked at Toby's hands, raw and scraped, and felt a surge of guilt mixed with pride. He was growing up too fast, his childhood stripped away by the harshness of their reality. But he was also surviving. He was no longer just a victim. He was a builder. The routine, however, bred a dangerous complacency. They had food, they had a wall, and they had a rhythm. But the frontier was never content to let anyone rest for long. It started with the silence. On the 7th day, the birds that usually chattered in the scrub oak vanished. The wind, which usually roared, died down to a sinister, breathless stillness. The sky turned a heavy, bruised color, like a healing hematoma, pressing down on the peaks of the hills. Sarah stood outside the cave, wiping her hands on her apron, and felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She knew this feeling. It was the atmospheric drop that preceded a prairie blizzard, the kind that buried homesteads and froze cattle where they stood. She looked at their woodpile. It was decent, enough for 2 days of normal burning, but a blizzard didn't care about normal. If the temperature dropped as low as she feared, they would need a roaring fire just to keep their blood liquid. "Toby, get the sack," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp. There was no time for gentleness. "We need wood, everything you can find, even the green stuff if you can break it." They scrambled down the slope, moving with a frantic energy. Sarah abandoned caution, tearing at dead branches in the ravine, snapping them with her boot, ignoring the scratches on her arms. They worked until the first flakes began to fall. Huge, heavy flakes that spiraled down lazily at first, then accelerated into a blinding curtain. The temperature plummeted so fast it felt like a physical blow. By the time they hauled their last load up the slope, the world had disappeared. The tree line, the creek, the horizon, all erased by a wall of white. They retreated behind their stone wall just as the wind returned, shrieking with a new demonic intensity. It slammed against the mountain, shaking the very ground. Sarah built the fire up, feeding it their precious stock, but the cold that seeped through the cracks was aggressive. It wasn't just cold, it was an entity, a presence seeking to extinguish them. Toby huddled under the blanket, coughing a dry, hacking sound that terrified Sarah more than the storm. The smoke from the fire swirled, unable to escape properly against the backdraft, stinging their eyes and filling the cave with a blue haze, but they didn't dare let it die. The night was an endurance test that stretched the limits of their sanity. The blizzard raged for hours, a deafening cacophony that made sleep impossible. Sarah sat with her back to the stone wall she had built, her body acting as a secondary shield for Toby. Every time the wind howled, the flames would dance wildly, threatening to snuff out, and Sarah would feed another branch, watching their stockpile dwindle with agonizing speed. By the early hours of the morning, the pile was critically low. They had perhaps 3 hours of fuel left. If the fire went out, the cave would become an icebox within an hour. Sarah stared at the last few logs, her mind racing. She couldn't let Toby freeze. She looked at the boy, fitfully sleeping, his breath wheezing slightly in the damp cold. The logic of survival was cold and binary. Stay and freeze, or go out and risk death to find fuel. She waited until the gray light of dawn began to filter through the snow-blocked entrance. The storm was still active, but the wind had shifted slightly. She stood up, wrapping the woolen blanket around her head and shoulders, tying it tight with a strip of cloth she'd torn from her hem. "Toby," she shook him awake gently, "I have to go out for a minute. You stay here. Feed the fire one stick at a time. Do not let it go out. Do you understand?" Toby grabbed her wrist, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't go, Mama. It's white out there." "I have to," she said, pulling her hand away gently. "I'll be right back. Count to 100 and I'll be back." It was a lie, but a necessary one. She grabbed the knife and stepped over the wall, plunging into the drift that had piled up against their fortification. The world outside was a chaotic void. There was no up or down, only white. The wind hit her like a solid object, nearly knocking her off her feet. She gasped, inhaling ice crystals that scoured her throat. She couldn't see the creek. She couldn't see the trees. She was blind. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling to keep her center of gravity low, feeling for the scrub brush she knew was to the left. Her hands were numb instantly. She groped blindly, panic rising in her throat like bile. If she lost her sense of direction, she would die 10 feet from her son. Her hand struck something hard, a thick branch of a fallen pine buried under the fresh drift. It was heavy, frozen to the ground. She hacked at it with the knife, screaming into the wind to generate force, chipping away until it cracked. She dragged it free, the weight immense, and turned back. But where was the cave? The snow had filled her tracks instantly. For 10 seconds, Sarah stood in the heart of the storm, completely lost, the white silence roaring in her ears. Then, a faint smell hit her. Wood smoke. It was the thinnest thread, but she grabbed it. She lunged forward, following the scent, dragging the log, until her hand hit the rough limestone of the entrance. She collapsed inside, gasping, covered in snow, but dragging life in with her. They spent the next 2 days trapped. The storm had dumped 3 feet of snow, sealing the lower half of the entrance and turning their world into a twilight confinement. But they were warm. The pine log Sarah had retrieved was resin-rich and burned hot, cracking with loud reports that sounded like gunfire. With the immediate threat of freezing gone, the cave took on a different atmosphere. It became a classroom. Sarah used the downtime to work. She couldn't just sit. The anxiety would eat her alive. She took the extra fish bones she had saved, cleaning them and drying them near the fire. Using a flat rock in the back of her knife, she ground the tips of the ribs against the stone, sharpening them into crude needles. It was slow, delicate work that required patience she didn't feel, but it kept her hands busy. She took the burlap sack, now empty, and began to unravel the top edge, pulling out long strands of jute thread. "Watch me, Toby," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke. She showed him how to thread the bone needle. The boy watched, fascinated. They worked together to repair the tears in their clothes, patching the holes where the wind used to get in. It wasn't professional tailoring. The stitches were uneven and the thread was coarse, but it was functional. As they worked, the dynamic shifted. They weren't just survivors cowering in a hole. They were improving their station. They talked, really talked, for the first time since leaving. Toby asked about the farm, about why they left. Sarah didn't sugarcoat it, but she didn't poison him with hate either. "Your father was a broken man," she said, pulling the needle through the wool. "And broken things sometimes cut the people holding them. We had to let go to stop bleeding." It was a hard truth, but Toby seemed to understand. He leaned against her, the fear of the storm replaced by the security of her presence. They were forging a new bond, one tempered in the cold, stronger than anything that had existed in the farmhouse. Finally, the temperature broke. It wasn't a sudden shift to summer, but the biting edge left the air. The sun came out, fierce and bright, turning the snow into a blinding expanse of diamonds. The dripping started at noon, a slow rhythmic plink, plink, plink of melting icicles falling from the overhang. It was the sound of victory. Sarah kicked down the snow blocking the upper part of the entrance and looked out. The world was still buried, but the creek was roaring, swollen with meltwater, cutting a dark, violent path through the white. She stepped out, shielding her eyes, and took a deep breath of the crisp air. It smelled of wet earth and pine, the scent of the world waking up. She looked to the east, back the way they had come. Somewhere, miles across that treacherous expanse, was the house with the locked door. She imagined Jeb sitting there, or perhaps he had already drunk himself into a grave. It didn't matter. The tether was cut. She looked down at her hands, scarred, calloused, dirt under the nails, but strong. She looked at Toby, who was throwing snowballs into the ravine, laughing for the first time in weeks. They had come here to die, or at least that's what the world had expected. Instead, they had carved a home out of rock. Sarah realized with a sudden crystal clarity that she didn't want to be rescued. To go back to town, to throw themselves on the charity of the church or the pity of neighbors, would be to admit defeat. It would be stepping back into a cage. Here, the rules were harsh, but they were honest. If you worked, you ate. If you built, you were warm. She turned back to the cave. There was much to do. The melt would bring mud, and she needed to weave a raised mat for their bedding. She needed to trap rabbits now that the snow was clearing. She needed to tan the fish skins to make waterproof pouches. "Toby," she called out, her voice ringing clear across the valley. "Come here. We need to gather clay before the ground freezes again tonight." The boy ran to her, his face bright. They weren't waiting for spring to save them. They were the spring. Sarah placed a hand on the stone wall she had built. It was solid. It held. And so did she.